you. Well, welcome everyone for today's first webinar of the Higher Education and Human Development event series under the theme of Rethinking and Reimagining Development through Higher Education. For today's sessions, the first session of this series, we have Dr. Colleen Howell, and she will be presenting about tertiary education in developing countries. Just to briefly introduce about Dr. Colleen, she's currently a lecturer in the Centre for International Education and Development at University College London Institute of Education, where she previously worked as a research associate on a project on higher education and the public good in 4 African countries. She holds a PhD in sociology and has been extensively involved over the last 20 years in education research and policy work in South Africa. Her work has primarily focused on the building of inclusive education and training systems. She has lectured and published on these issues and contributed to a number of national government policy initiatives. Between 1998 and 2014, she worked at the University of the Western Cape in the Education Policy Unit, and then as the Director of Institutional Research. So we would like to thanks again once more to Dr. Colleen for being here today in this first webinar, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Carmen, and hello to everybody. I think I'm going to try and share my screen, but first of all, just let me say hello to everybody and thank you all for coming. It's really a lovely opportunity to be able to share this really lovely project that I was involved in. And just to say that much of what I'm going to share is a lot. This was very much a collaborative project with my colleagues Elaine Unterholter and Moses Okech. So much of what I'm going to share with you is very much their thinking as well as mine. So yeah, I think I'll just start, and let me just, if you don't see my presentation, just let me know, but I'm going to hopefully just share my screen with you, and then okay, now I'm having a bit of problem sharing my screen. Okay. Can you see that now?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. So basically, as Carmen said, the presentation I'm going to do today, or the seminar that I'm going to be engaging with you today, is on the role of tertiary education in developing countries, or the role of tertiary education in the development of low and lower middle income countries. And basically, it draws very strongly from a big rigorous review of literature that I undertook with my colleagues at UCL for the British Council. And so I'm going to just take you basically through the research and our findings and some of the critical issues. And then I think at the end, what I'd like to do is, coming out of the presentation and the research, is just to raise a few issues that either things that came up for us in the research that would be good to hear your thoughts on, or just some questions that I think we all need to be thinking about in terms of higher education, particularly in low and lower middle income or developing countries. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a bit of an introduction to explain where the study comes from and where I'm coming from. And then I'm going to share with you the conceptual framework that we used, our research questions, and the overview of the methodology. All of this is obviously in detail in the report, so I'm just going to try and go through that fairly quickly to give you a sense of that. And then I'm just going to take you through some of the what I think are some of the interesting parts of the evidence that we came across. And then probably, hopefully, the most important part is some of the conclusions, reflections that were there. And hopefully that will give us opportunity to chat more about what's come up. Okay, and please stop me if there's something that's not clear or I'm going too fast or anything like that. Okay, so just to this rigorous review that the British Council contracted us to do actually was a sort of follow on from an earlier study that my colleagues Moses and Tristan and Rebecca had done for DFID on the impact of tertiary education on development. So our terms of reference very much were about taking over or sort of starting from the point that they left off in their study. But I also wanted to mention that quite a lot of our thinking around the project also drew from another very big project that Carmen mentioned that I was involved in, which was this project on higher education and the public good in 4 African countries. And that's actually the reason I came to work at the IOE and that was in South Africa, Kenya, Ghana and Nigeria. And there's some sort of fundamental thinking around that certainly we took forward in this review. And so that's the link for the review if you haven't got it already. And then I think that Melanie did send out a paper that we've developed subsequently, which is just sort of drawing on the evidence that we found in the review and then thinking about it in relation to tertiary education's role in taking forward the SDGs. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to share with you is the conceptual framework, because we've spent a lot of time on this and we certainly came back to it a couple of times as we went along. But our starting point, and we actually presented this to the British Council before we started the actual review process, because we felt we wanted to be clear that we were on the right track. And so basically what you can see is the diagram that we put together. And our argument was that we started, first of all, with kind of thinking about what are the core functions of higher education or tertiary education. And I think it's important to remember that our brief was around tertiary education, so post-school education. And although there are many different ways in which this can be framed, we suggested as a way of thinking about it that there's a teaching and learning function, the research function, the innovation function, and the engagement function. And we suggested that, and this was largely drawing a lot from our public good project, is that those core functions, their ability to contribute, whether it's to seeing it in relation to development or the public good or whatever one understands the role of tertiary education, those functions and their ability to play those roles are either enabled or constrained by a range of contextual conditions. And in our public good project, we called those the conditions of possibility. So they either enable the realization of higher education or tertiary education's role in the public good, or in this case, we see them as either enabling or constraining the role of tertiary education in development. So those core functions then, taking that context into account, contribute or lead to what we saw as what we called pathways of change or processes of change towards the realization of different development outcomes. And we came up with what we saw as a number of ways of thinking about those development outcomes. And I think certainly they're certainly not the kind of things that are cast in stone, but they were the ways in which we tried to make sense of it. But you'll see we've got jagged edges all over the place, and that was really to try and show that these are fluid areas, they overlap each other, and they were just a way of us trying to think about how we could begin to map the evidence that exists. And the first one, which is probably the one that's the most thought about, is graduate skill and knowledge. And then we actually distinguished that from what we called enhanced professional knowledge, understanding and skill among all workers. And that was trying to think through more about issues of professional knowledge and understanding that around the professions and people working in tertiary education, and how that forms a very important part of development. And then the third one, which is also dominates a great deal of the discussion, is the issues of economic growth. But we wanted to kind of frame it within the notion of equitable and sustainable economic growth. And then we had poverty reduction and the development of sustainable livelihoods. Then we had equitable and sustainable relationships, new knowledge that contributes to technological and social innovation, strengthened and transformed institutions, strengthened basic education provision, and strong and engaged civil society. So those are what we saw as the kind of range of, from our own experience and looking a little bit at the literature at the beginning, was the kind of range of development outcomes that we could be thinking about in relation to the role of tertiary education. But what we also wanted to try and emphasize is that this is not a sort of linear process necessarily. So there is this kind of relationship, or this path, what we call the pathway of change. But those outcomes certainly go back and impact at a system, institutional, group and individual level on tertiary education and on that context of which tertiary education is a part. So that's how we try to think about it, and we use this as a framework to think about the issues, but also to actually map the evidence and organize it and make sense of it. So with that in mind, our research questions were to what evidence is there in lower and lower middle income countries? And I just want to stop there and just emphasize that lower and lower middle income countries are the way in which the World Bank, or the British Council uses this, and DFID and those kind of things, way in which they would organize different countries. And so if we're thinking about it from an Africa perspective, that would exclude South Africa. And I'm going to show you some interesting things coming up just now about the Africa issue and the South Africa issue, because what we found that, for example, in our public good project, is when we included South Africa with other African countries, South Africa completely dominated the literature about tertiary education and higher education. But when we took the South Africa out of the equation, the African literature still was quite prominent, and I found that really interesting, and I'll talk more about that just now. So what evidence is there in lower middle income countries of a relationship, whether direct or indirect, between the core functions of tertiary education and a range of development outcomes that are both economic and non-economic, public and private? And included in this, what methodologies have been used in these studies? And next, what does the existing evidence suggest about the factors that enable or constrain pathways that link the core functions of tertiary education and the many faceted outcomes associated with the development of low and lower middle income countries? What is the scope of this evidence? What gaps exist and what conclusions can be reached about the strength of the available evidence? And what evidence is there of how development outcomes feed back to strengthen tertiary education? Okay, so just to give you a quick overview of the methods that we used. So when we started, we searched a range of databases, and our idea here was to really try and go beyond just sort of some of the mainstream databases, particularly regional databases like, I guess in South Africa, probably I know the most about would be the African ones, like the African Journals Online, Cadastria, those kind, but also obviously similar kind of things in Asia and other parts of the world. And in our engagement with those databases, we had very specific parameters, like, as I said already, we had to do it had to be published from 2010 onwards. and it had to deal with a lower middle income context, and it had to be concerned with tertiary education, etc., which in and of itself was quite challenging, is because, as you know, it can be defined in different ways. What constitutes tertiary education in different contexts may be different. So when we did that search, we found about 2,850 studies that we identified for further screening. And then we did a fairly rigorous process of screening the titles and abstracts for what we called the conceptual relevance. And I think what's important to emphasize there when we say conceptual relevance is that we wanted to be clear that there was, in the article or the research that we were looking at, the connections were being made between tertiary education and development in some way. So, and I'll talk more about that later, because there was a lot of evidence that we exclude, a lot of articles that we excluded because that connection was not always clear. And that process of mapping resulted in a smaller version of about 1,400 studies, and then that level of we wanted to see, sort of, before we got into looking at whether that constituted the evidence that we were looking for, we wanted to get a picture of those studies. And so we actually did a first level of mapping of those studies. Now, I think what's really important at this stage is we had started our sort of endeavor. We started the research process with the idea that we'd really like to include particularly French and Spanish and Chinese literature in it, because we're very aware of how skewed the picture is, where English is only the only language that one looks at. But we started just before COVID, and we had quite limited time, and after trying to sort of explore that, we eventually decided we just couldn't manage it. So we did collect some of that evidence, but we didn't include it in our final because we just didn't feel that it was rigorous enough, the processes around those other languages. So we landed up only mapping and considering those that had been the studies that had published in English. And with those, we then looked at their contextual focus, so the region and the country that they spoke to, and their which of the development outcomes did they discuss or talk about. And I'll show you some of the outcomes of that in a minute. Then, coming out of that, we went through a fairly kind of comprehensive process of thinking about, well, okay, we've got all these studies now. How do we now search or kind of exclude for lack of evidence? And this whole issue of what constitutes evidence was a really big discussion that we went through, because there's quite a lot of studies where the basis on which you include or exclude on evidence is whether there's empirical data provided through the research or not. And we wanted to be careful that we didn't exclude, for example, some important historical studies that were rigorous in their research, but that didn't necessarily result in the kind of empirical evidence that would be at another study that had done qualitative or quantitative research and provided empirical evidence. So we developed a fairly comprehensive evidence framework, and that's in the report if you want to go and look at it. But we drew from quite a lot of things that have been written, particularly around qualitative research and what constitutes evidence around that. And so basically we then engaged with the studies, and based on reading the full text, particularly the methodologies that they'd used and the kind of capturing of evidence and the arguments around the evidence, we excluded a substantial amount of the studies, and we came up with a final list of 170 studies, and that was basically what we called our evidence base. So that was really what we did a lot more analysis of, and that's basically what our evidence that we presented in the review is based on. So we then, I think a central concern for us was then to say, okay, if we wanted to go back to our conceptual framework, how do we use that to then map and engage with this evidence? And so a big part of what we did was to map what we called the nature of the change that was evident from the research between tertiary education and one or more of the development outcomes. And we talked about that in relation to direction of change and the nature of the change, of the modality. And the direction was, we mapped it as either being positive, where there was a very positive, it was very evident that tertiary education was contributing to positive change in relation to those development outcomes. Then what we called misaligned or mismatched, where there was some kind of misalignment between tertiary education and the development outcome. And then what we called mixed. And just to say at this stage, I think an interesting thing for us and something that we grappled a lot with, and I'm going to come back to this later, is this notion of misalignment and negative, etc. Because we initially started to talk about negative and essentially saying that tertiary education can have negative, the pathway or can be that process of change can be negative. And the best example that I can give you, and I'll come back to later, is the whole issue of the reproduction, the social reproduction of inequalities, or sort of higher education's role, you know, in the reproduction of elites and those kind of things, and so whether it plays a negative role in relation to equitable relationships, etc. But in some of the initial thinking, we were challenged about that, both from colleagues and our own thinking, is that it's not quite as simple as that always, and that the relationship is not always a negative one. And I'll come back to that and show how actually the notion of misalignment or mismatch was much more useful in trying to grapple with that issue. And then the second part, which we thought, we engaged with, was what we called the modality and whether the relationship was a linear one. So, for example, graduates go to university or go to further education and training, they get certain skills, and that leads to higher income, and that higher income leads to economic development, in a very linear kind of way. But as I'll show you just now, is that the relationship is often much more complex than that. And so we tried to sort of look at the evidence in relation to whether it is either linear or complex. And then we also tried to pick up what the enabling or hindering factors are that may be impacting on those pathways to change that I've talked about. So, oh, sorry, I don't know what's happened. I'm just trying to get to the next slide. Okay, so just quickly, this is just, you can see this in the report, and I won't go through. I just wanted to show you the way we tried to sort of present the evidence in a sort of accessible way, is that and it was partly also what the British Council wanted of us, is to sort of give the citation the type of source, the region, country and region where it spoke to, the research method that was used in the evidence, and then the first development outcome. We actually coded first and second because often they spoke to more than one, but the main sort of the main research was around the first development outcome, and then which of the core functions of tertiary education was involved in the relationship between this development outcome, and often it was more than one. And then the pathway to change that I spoke about, and whether it was the nature and direction. Okay, So this is just something I thought was really interesting that I thought I would share with you. There's so much that I could share with you about the evidence and everything and that initial mapping. But when we, before we actually, sifted the initial sources down to only those that where there was clear evidence, research evidence that we could use, the picture was more strongly orientated to South Asia, and particularly literature from India, and Sub-Saharan Africa was much smaller in relation to the picture. But if you look at it on the right-hand side, you'll see that when we filtered out those that didn't provide rigorous enough evidence, then Sub-Saharan Africa becomes much more dominant, and I think that's really interesting. And now, while we found, and there's other research that has shown how sort of, and I'm trying to use my words carefully because I'm going to come to this later, how the research ecology of many African countries is fairly underdeveloped, and significantly compromised by contextual issues. Actually, in relation to other parts of the world with low and low middle income countries, there's some nice suggestion that there is some interesting research capacity there. Okay, so this is just one of the tables that I thought would just be nice to share with you. And this was when we looked at our development outcomes, when we plotted them against the nature of the change that I've spoken about. So whether the change was positive, misaligned, or was both positive and or misaligned. So what we call both or mixed. And I just picked up a few that I thought were really interesting, and I'm going to talk more about them just now. But for example, when we looked at the issue of graduate skill and knowledge, it was strongly suggesting that it's either misaligned or it has some positives, but also some misaligned elements. And the other one is equitable relationships, where it's very interesting is that where there's some evidence of a positive role, there's a lot of evidence as well, or relatively larger amount of evidence that relationship is one that's misaligned or having mixed outcomes. In fact, the mixed is the strongest, suggesting that so while tertiary education may be contributing to the creation of equitable relationships, it may also be deepening inequalities, or may be contributing to the deepening of inequalities. And I think sort of one of the kind of more sobering ones, but as important, is also the sense that there is misalignment between new knowledge that contributes to technological and social innovation. And an important concern for us there was was thinking about that new knowledge in relation to the needs of those countries and what is needed in terms of technological and social innovation. And the sense that I think we discussed more in depth in the report is that things like ranking systems and all that those kind of issues, the sort of global knowledge inequalities, skew that kind of new knowledge generation towards meeting those outcomes or expectations, rather than potentially responding to the needs of those particular contexts. I think an interesting one, we didn't have this initially, and the British Council asked us to specifically look at the role of tertiary education in relation to strengthening basic education provision. And so we actually went back and did more research around this, and obviously a particularly important part of that was the issue around teacher education. And there was a strong emphasis there around a misalignment between what teachers are being taught, or kind of the experience of pre-service training, and their experiences in the classroom. And I mean, I think there are people here who probably know that a lot better than I do, but it's that kind of mismatch between what teachers are learning and the reality of the classrooms, and the ability to translate those learnings into practice in the classroom. One of the issues that I'm going to talk more about is what I found really interesting and particularly important was the sort of relative, and it's a small evidence base, but a relatively strong orientation towards civil society and tertiary educations in strengthening civil society. So I'm just going to now go through just 3 that I chose to share with you around the development outcomes. And so this one was about tertiary education's role in contributing to economic growth. And I think it was really interesting because it's by far the biggest body of evidence in the evidence base that we looked at. And it shows that economic growth and enhanced earnings for graduates are crucial development outcomes associated with tertiary education. And I mean, that's not new. There are other studies that have shown that, but I think it's important that this was confirmed through this evidence. But although some of the evidence highlights that aggregate economic growth is not well distributed and that the income benefits of participating in tertiary education tend to go to groups that are already established in dominant political and economic positions, so that the reproduction of the elites, etc., the evidence as a whole points in a positive direction, associated with national economic growth, regional development initiatives, increased labour market opportunities and earnings for graduates, and skill enhancement that contributes to productivity. And just if you're interested, and I just, I think the overall finding is the most important, but it's interesting that the majority of studies here spoke to the teaching and learning function of tertiary education. Only 5 spoke to the research function, compared to 59. So it's suggesting that the contribution to economic growth is not being researched in relation to the research function of tertiary education, particularly higher education. And I think that's points to some of the kind of joining of the dots around some of the issues that we came across. By far dominated by quantitative methods, and these were all about what we called the application of statistical methods, so things like regression analysis and Munserian equations and a whole range of these kind of things. So most of them were about big data sets where people had engaged with the data and then, done particular statistical inferences, etc., from that data. But it's interesting, as I've already said, that there was a strong orientation to positive or positive to some degree. And so, generally, the notion that in low and lower middle income countries, tertiary education plays an important role in contributing to economic growth, and especially equitable and sustainable economic growth. And that quite a lot of these studies suggested a fairly linear process to pathway to that. But was still a fairly large proportion that suggested that even this relationship is complex and needs to be kind of understood from that perspective. So the other one I thought that was very interesting, that I've already showed you just why it's interesting, is this contributing to graduate skill and knowledge. And here the main finding, as I've already suggested, was the strong perceived, and I think it's important to recognize that this is what the research showed, a perceived mismatch or misalignment between the skills and knowledge of graduates and the needs of the labour markets in low and lower middle income countries. So although the nature and scope of this mismatch might differ slightly across countries and regions, and that was fairly interesting to see at times, attention is often drawn to the curriculum within tertiary education institutions and the extent to which it's regarded as not adequately providing graduates with the skills and knowledge that are needed for their country's development. And this was, so it was interesting. There were different ways in which this was looked at and thought about, but generally there was arguments around the inadequacy or the inappropriateness or the kind of, and I think even something like the colonial legacy would come into this, the extent to which those issues that ensure that the curriculum is not sufficiently creating the kinds of skills and knowledge which countries need, those countries need for their effective development. And it was, only, I think what's important is that only 3 of those studies showed evidence of positive change, and 11 were misaligned and 11 showed mixed. So there was either this kind of sense of misalignment, or there was both some misalignment and some positives. And once again, they spoke again to the teaching function. So you can already see just from what I'm sharing is that there was this dominance of the teaching function, the teaching and learning function of tertiary education as contributing to the development outcomes in low and low middle income countries. So the third one, which I found really, really interesting, and one of the reasons why we brought this in is that in our public good project that I spoke to you about, we'd also conceptualized this relationship between higher education in that project and the public good, as most of the literature speaking about it in relation to a more an instrumental role. So something that you participate in higher education and it leads to some kind of manifestations of the public good in the future. And a good example would be graduates learn knowledge, and then the particular kinds of skills and knowledge contributes to the public good when they leave university or whatever. But the other way in which it's often conceptualized, and we found very interesting and important, was that the argument that higher education becomes a very, very important space for the enactment of the public good. And it's often through the experience of higher education, people's participation in processes of higher education, their exposure to different things, their exposure to forms of diversity, to understandings of difference, all those kind of things are very important, and that contributes in a number of different ways to the public good. And so this notion of strengthening of civil society, I think, would fit very strongly into that notion of tertiary education contributing as a particular space to the development of civil society and the strengthening of civil society. And so we said that although drawing from a small body of literature, that evidence in this review shows that tertiary education plays, or has the potential to play, a very important role in strengthening and building the capacity of a vibrant and engaged civil society. And we said change is enabled by the kinds of knowledge and skills that graduates acquire, and through the space that institutions provide for forms of engagement and relationship building, especially in the context of strengthening and building democracy. And however, I think what was especially important here is that the evidence also shows that tertiary education's relationship with civil society often involves managing complex processes and conflicting influences, all of which institutions and systems are required to manage. And I know Terry's on the in the webinar, and I have to say a couple of Terry's really important pieces around students and student participation in higher education were part of this evidence base. So I think it's really important that, something around that notion of tertiary education as a space was an important finding, although the evidence base is small. And what's interesting as well is that we coded these as all speaking largely to the engagement function of tertiary education. And but as I've already said, most of them also suggested that the pathway to change is a complex one, and as I said, often requires particularly complex processes at the institutional level. Okay, so I think I'm coming to the end, and I just now wanted to go through some of our overarching conclusions, and also suggest these as kind of issues that you may want to bring up in the discussion. Okay, I think what's important to say is first is that the whole process highlighted for us gaps in the evidence base concerning the relationship between tertiary education and development outcomes. And what we found is there's a lot more literature that is speaking to these issues now. So ones that explore and analyze policy and practice around tertiary education. But it does not consider or establish what development outcomes emerge. In many studies, this relationship is talked about through the expression of an ideal or assertions about what should be happening rather than what is happening. So we found a lot of interesting studies where in the kind of conclusion, the writer or the researcher would make some kind of suggestion that this has implications for a country or a region's development. But the evidence itself wasn't really showing or speaking to that relationship. And so while there's been this surge and increase in low middle income countries on literature on tertiary education, the base around that relationship and showing that relationship in real ways was a lot more limited when you use that as our criteria. But I think overall, and especially if you look at some of the development outcomes in particular, we concluded that the potential of tertiary education with regard to its role in development in low middle income countries is not being fully realized. And this was a sort of conclusion we reached looking across a fairly wide range of economic and non-economic development outcomes. And I'm going to come back to how we sort of think about those issues. I think what's important is also to say is that we also concluded that the effects of tertiary education on development may be underappreciated in many ways, and it's actually hard to research that relationship. And so this is partly because the literature selected for this review is strongly orientated to documenting the links, direct or indirect, which are evident between tertiary education institutions or the system and particular development outcomes that we were looking at. But we said, however, that there are many underlying conditions of a society with regard to health, levels of education, infrastructural provision, and institutional development that are all in some ways associated with the outcomes of tertiary education. And even if the pathway of connection or that pathway of change, both historical and contemporary, cannot be precisely plotted. So we were suggesting that kind of trying to understand that relationship is difficult, and it's not always easy to just kind of be able to make a clear kind of, I would say, finding on the relationship between tertiary education and development in low and lower middle income countries. I think the biggest thing, and I've raised it as a question that I hope we can discuss more, and it's certainly not the first study that has found this, but we spoke quite a bit about the difficulties for tertiary education in low and lower middle income countries in developing and strengthening the ecology for research, and this emerged as a central concern in this review. So, of the 4 pillars of tertiary education reviewed, the smallest segment of studies deal with research. The conclusion from the studies was that the research relationships tend to be weak and or out of step with the social, political, environmental, health or economic needs of the countries. And, there's a number of reasons why that is the case. The reasons for this need, and we said they need closer investigation. And we said that possibly needs to build on some of the work that's already been done in the studies of, for example, the African flagship universities that Nico Clutie and others the Czech people have done, and taking on board a wider range of tertiary education institutions, a wider understanding of research partnerships, and some of the issues highlighted in thinking about various mismatches illuminated in this study. So we're saying that this needs close investigation. We need to also think about how we're understanding these relationships, how we're judging these issues, how we are researching them. So all of that needs further investigation. But I think even if we take that into account, we still need to recognize that the research capacity of tertiary education, particularly higher education, in most low and lower middle income countries is weak, and that has profound implications for the kind of knowledge systems, who is informing the knowledge systems, how are they being informed, etc. And so obviously one of our key recommendations is about the importance of building research capacity across tertiary education, particularly higher education in low and lower middle income countries. I think what was really, really interesting, and another finding for us that we spoke more about in terms of our recommendation as sort of something that needs real attention. And, you know, one of the things from the British Council's point of view was where should international development aid be put in terms of strengthening tertiary education. And one of our things was that the research showed clearly the value and importance of partnerships and networks, suggesting that in low and lower middle income countries, tertiary education's role in development is strongly enabled through its participation within collaborative relationships and partnerships. And I think what's really important is that, similarly to the issues of civil society, etc., there are a range of contextual complexities that render these relationships and partnerships extremely vulnerable. And those stretch from funding issues to power relationships and how are low and lower middle income countries, the position they occupy in these relationships. And I want to say here that some of the best examples that we found were collaborative relationships between key stakeholders and groups within those countries. So building particular kinds of partnerships that strengthened the role and importance of tertiary education in those societies. So, okay, so the last thing is a set of questions that I wanted to raise that I thought might be helpful for us to think about or talk about. And so one of the things that we grappled with, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts, is how can we make sense of the degrees of misalignment or mismatch that were evident in this review outside of what I've called a deficit paradigm that reinforces the kind of failure of lower middle and lower middle income. So, you know, there's a kind of sense that it's all wrong and nothing's going right. And how do we not look at and judge these things outside of a deficit paradigm? Then the role of tertiary education in the reproduction of inequalities, and drawing from our public good project, what we call public bad, but in this project was kind of negative pathways to change. And we definitely found that there are a number of ways in which tertiary education may maintain hierarchies and exclusions and may be complicit in relations of violence, and thus reinforcing or deepening existing inequalities. And so, you know, and I know, you know, there are many examples where tertiary education is deeply implicit, not only in reproducing structural inequalities, but also particular forms of violence within societies. And what do we know about how well positioned the tertiary education sector is in lower and lower middle income countries to implement the SDGs? And so this really relates to Elaine and I's paper that we wrote coming out of that, is that if the evidence is skewed towards the wealthiest lower middle income countries, which it was in this case, even if we don't think about the north-south issues, the location of research communities and associated research capacities, including funding and networks associated, are all with the global north. Usually, where they do engage the global south, it's with middle income or lower middle income rather than the low income countries. And that obviously, as I said already, is that new knowledge to support implementation of the SDGs is limited and skewed towards those by those inequalities. So our argument, both in the review and in the article, is that there's a need for strengthening of tertiary education with better support to connect its core functions with the holistic vision of the SDGs, or in terms of the review, with the development, with those range of development outcomes. So that's my presentation, and I just thought it would be very nice now to open it up to have some discussion about these issues, and obviously to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Colleen, for this very insightful and comprehensive mapping of tertiary education in developing countries. It has been really wonderful to immerse ourselves into your analysis and findings, and I'm sure that we're going to have many questions for you, not only the ones that you already brought to the table, but many that came out of the presentation. So I would like to know whether you want to take one question or two at a time. What would you prefer?
Whatever's what you think will work best, Karen. I mean, really happy to do whatever you would like to do.
Okay, I think we can go for two at a time. And for everyone attending the presentation, please use the button of raise your hand that you have at the top of your screen. And yeah, as far as you click it, I can name the people so you can enter into the conversation. Just remember to unmute your mic before I started talking. So the two first questions for Colleen.
Can I go, Carmen?
Yes.
Because
yes.
Nobody else is responding. So it might give people a bit of time to think about it. Thanks, Colleen. That was really interesting. And the full report is quite dense, so it's quite helpful to have it introduced and spoken about in this way. And it was a really excellent presentation. So thank you very much for that. I've just got a few small comments and questions. The one is to agree that there's a real challenge about thinking about the relationship of higher education and development outcomes, because often our research remains at the point of the kind of development that happens within higher education and which might contribute, but we don't actually know. So we make assumptions about that, and that seems to be something we should perhaps think about a bit more. But I have a question about process, I think, and then a question about development. So the question about process, which is an information question, in terms of the 170 papers that you eventually selected, who were the authors of these papers? So what was the distribution of authorship between people based in the South and people based in the North? And what was the distribution in terms of the journals that they published in, and how many of these journals were based in the South and how many in the North? I don't know if you can answer that, but it's a question which to me seems important because it's about location and context and so on. So so that's the one question. The second question is, and I might have missed this in the presentation, is how was development itself understood in doing this review? There seems to be a slight taken for grantedness around this thing called development, and I wonder how that might relate to post-development literature, decolonial literature, and so on. And then related to that, why the SDGs? Why should higher education in developing countries be aligned with the SDGs, notwithstanding that there was a more inclusive process of producing them, which also included the global south. They have taken on a life of their own, and I think are, yeah, so it's some of those broader questions which I'd be quite interested in hearing about.
Thank you, Melanie. Given that we have 3 questions, you can go ahead, Colleen. I think they are tough enough.
Okay. So yeah, those are all really nice questions to think about. I mean, so let me just first of all say about that knowledge spread. I mean, I can't say to you what it is from a rigorous kind of analysis, because we didn't plot that, although you've given me an idea that, I mean, we've got it now all there and we could do this, so it would be a really nice thing to do this. But I would, you know, just, and this would be anecdotally from having gone through the evidence, is that I think that we really tried to kind of move, you know, by looking at the evidence that only spoke to a particular context or whatever, we tried to we tried to ensure that what came out of that was quite a lot of local researchers that were talking. But I would say that even though we tried to look at, you know, databases and that go beyond the sort of mainstream, I would still say that about 2/3 were what I would call the kind of mainstream journals. But there was a sort of, I'd say at least 1/3, which are kind of journals that I'd never heard of or whatever, that kind of really, you know, did suggest fairly local kind of engagement that was really, really interesting. But I think, and I mean, I really think this is, you know, this is one of the, I'm not sure in my own mind about this, how you do, but I think language for me plays the greatest role in that, because even if you sort of think about the global south, and even journals that are coming out of lower and lower middle income countries, the ones that dominate are the ones that are written or published in English. So you know, let's say I mean, we're not even vaguely beginning to look at things like India and those kind of contexts of the literature that is written in other languages there. So, you know, I think that issue of voice and process, I think, is absolutely vital. And I think I would say there's lots of flaws in the way, you know, this process, because in many ways we went a very traditional kind of, I mean, I don't know if traditional is the right word, but a very limited way, in a way, because we just did it in a very kind of we started before COVID, and so then, you know, once COVID thing, we were very limited to what we could get access to online, and that in itself caused a whole lot of issues. So, you know, my sense is that if one wanted to really go more deeply and engage, it would really involve going to different places and engaging with maybe dissertations and theses and those kind of things that maybe are engaging in research that's not necessarily published in available spaces and that. But I think it's a really, but I'm thinking, you know, I think it might be worth as well going back and looking at which journals are there and where the, you know, the institutional affiliations of the people writing the papers. So yeah, I mean, just in terms of the development issue, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's. I think that's partly the way I presented it, because in the report we do try to problematize it a little bit, but we certainly don't problematize it enough. I think, you know, taken the parameters of what was asked of us, and that we tried to start or try to kind of emphasize the notion of development as both being about economic and non-economic as a kind of key starting point. And that's where we wanted to flesh out those development outcomes in a way that we tried to frame it as having a kind of fairly holistic kind of understanding. But it, you know, I mean, as I say, there's a little bit in our in the report on building our, particularly in the building the conceptual framework part, where we try to problematize the development of it. But yeah, I think it's definitely it's kind of a limitation of the study. At the end of the day, the kind of mapping process requires you to sort of define it in kind of, yeah, not necessarily fairly, not uncomplicated ways. I was going to say problematic, but I don't think it's really problematic. I think, you know, it's still useful, but I think one has to be very careful as the way one thinks about it. Yeah, and Melanie, your last point about the SDGs, I think is a really, really valuable point. And I wish Elaine was here to help to answer this, because I think she's much more knowledgeable about the SDGs than me. I think so, and this is what I would argue, is that I think taken the knowledge, the global knowledge framework that exists out there, taken the issue of global inequalities, global issues, etc., whether we like it or not, the SDGs are an important part of that. And so for me, if we don't think about the SDGs and engage around it, then those SDGs are driving particular, or kind of engagements around the SDGs are driving particular agendas. And if we don't engage with them, we don't have the, I think, we don't sufficiently create spaces to challenge or reframe or rethink some of those agendas. So I do think that it's partly strategic, that I think it's important to strategically engage with the SDGs as the framework that is driving a whole lot of issues. And, you know, if you can try and shift some of the thinking around those things, you know, understanding the SDGs in context, those kind of things, then I think one is, at least, even if it's in a very small and insignificant way, maybe shifting the thinking a little bit. So yeah, I think that's what I hope that's answered some of your question.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks very much. I'll leave it to others now to ask their questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie and Colleen. We have another question from Bridget.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Colleen. This was lovely. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and like Melanie said, the report I read yesterday is very dense. So this helps, and I'm going to definitely go back to it anyway. I've got a little bit of a question around some of what you're speaking about, the labour market and the graduate sort of mismatch. So the SDGs provide us with sort of a global framework for social justice, and that includes issues of human rights and democracy. And, you know, when we then drill down and say, well, what can higher education do towards or for that? We want our graduates, you know, sort of a while back they were all referred to as graduate attributes. You know, our graduates ought to be able to wield skills and diversity and leadership and creativity and teamwork and conflict management and communication. So it's really, so when we look at the SDGs, they ask more of us than just this development and the skills development. They ask kind of a consciousness of our graduates to be particularly sort of conscious, yeah, I suppose, of human rights and those kinds of things. What happens, though, I've found in some of the, well, in all the countries, I suppose, is that these skills get split off. They become an add-on. You know, they get farmed off to student affairs divisions. They get farmed off to a little sort of a weekend course on leadership or whatever. And the idea then is that, yeah, it's an add-on, an afterthought rather than an embeddedness. Is there something you can say a little bit about that? Oh, and let me add, the complexity to this is this COVID culture that we kind of are all kind of going home and we're sitting in front of screens, as if in front of screens we can develop competencies around diversity and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, I think it's quite hard, you know, that body of evidence that we looked at in terms of graduate, it was really quite diverse in the sense of how it approached the issues and how it looked at it and all that kind of. Some of them were quite sort of almost kind of, for want of a better word, mechanistic, between this is what graduates are learning and this is how it's, you know, this is the opinion of employers, and that, you know, but without really sort of, well, what's going wrong kind of thing. But then there were a couple of studies where I think points exactly to the kind of issues that you're raising about the nature of the curriculum and how, you know, whatever you're learning, it's not just about what you're learning, but how you're learning and those kind of things, and how you are learning to apply particular forms of knowledge and all that kind of thing. And so definitely this, you know, this kind of issue that, so that mismatch would also, in the context of low and lower middle income countries, I mean, a kind of example that I could give you would be around teachers, for example. And so, you know, in their undergraduate, you know, learning a couple of things, but then they go to, or learning particular ways of engaging and pedagogical practice or whatever, and then they go and work in classrooms where they're confronted with a range of learning needs and all those kind of things. I mean, and they are not able to really apply that learning in practice. And so it's not just about learning about diversity in their pre-service training. It's about sort of constructions of a house, you know, constructions around diversities of knowledge and engagement with the curriculum and all that they're not really learning, and then but they're expected to engage with that when they start teaching. So there were some, you know, there is some evidence of people grappling with those things, and obviously the issues, you know, that's why I mentioned the decolonization issues, is that, you know, you're asking graduates to go and build or kind of contribute to the development of countries deeply framed within persistent colonial relations, and the curriculum is not, in fact, I mean, you could, I think, you know, go so far as to bring in the sort of issues of epistemic violence in it. So the curricula are not equipping those students to really engage sufficiently with that, or take forward the decolonization issues that are important. So that mismatch was like really kind of a broad spectrum of ways of understanding this relationship between tertiary education and graduate skills and knowledge. And so that's why I asked this last, and if I put it down, I can't remember but the last question was, what does this mean in the COVID context or post-COVID? Because I think for me, some of the kind of mismatches and misalignments and even those negative process of change, I think those have been deepened, you know, those are potentially being deepened and I think will carry on being deepened for a while to come.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Bridget?
No, I just want to say thanks, Colleen. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful question. We have someone else, Angela.
Thank you very much, ladies. Very, very interesting topic. I just want to understand from the researchers, did they consider the way, specifically here in South Africa, we do it in terms of the interpretation of the medium-term strategic framework, which is the government's role in terms of interpreting the sustainable development goals. They translate that and send that to the universities to understand and interpret the human resource skills development needs, which is done through a student enrollment plan, translating the scarce skills, etc., and producing the necessary graduates to enable them to fit into the agenda of the government towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Have that been considered? Are you aware of that process? Thank you very much.
I think that's a really interesting point. So, you know, and I have to stress that, you know, that the review was not about the SDGs. So that was the further paper where we drew on the review to just sort of think about some of those issues. But some of the papers certainly spoke to the issue of the role of tertiary education in meeting the human resource needs of particular context. And sometimes those were framed through government policy frameworks. So similar to the medium-term expenditure framework kind of idea. But each of the countries, obviously, that would be different to them. And I wouldn't be able to say to what extent, you know, like South Africa, there's a sort of focus on that link to the SDGs or whatever. But certainly there were, and you know, it's a small body of evidence. I think one has to be careful. But certainly there were some studies that argued quite strongly that tertiary education was failing the state in that sense because it wasn't meeting those human resource needs. But I would be very cautious about some of that evidence because I think it's quite small, and sometimes the studies were quite small, and it's very, you know, you have to, for me, some of the studies, for example, would be from a particular profession point of view. So let's say engineers or whatever, and that's one thing, but whether that means that tertiary education is not equipping other professional, you know, like healthcare workers or whatever, is you can't make judgments because it's doing one, you know, it's said to be doing one thing with one, you know. So I think you have to be really careful how you interpret all that. But, you know, I think that it's exactly the point that you raised, or, you know, for me, is how do you make those judgments around that mismatch? I think that's really important. And I think we recognize that this is just one way of engaging with the issues, but we have to be very careful about, you know, the conclusions we draw.
Thank you, Angela and Colleen. We have another question from Bertha.
Thanks, Carmen. And thank you, Colleen, for a very clear and interesting presentation. So I have one question, and again, I'm not sure if it's a question or it's just a point for maybe further thinking. I know that you have mentioned this, and I do agree with you that there's a lot, there's less being said about the contribution of research towards economic development, or I would say development in general. There's less being said about the research part from university, but we rather concentrate on the teaching role of universities. And so now I'm trying to think, or I'm asking myself if in this analysis of yours, in case you thought of a why question to why there's less towards the contribution of research, because I'm trying to think from Tanzanian perspective. I know there's always a complaint on saying that there's less funding towards research in universities. I'm trying to think perhaps this could be one of the reasons, or if you came out with another result or you thought of another maybe reasons to why there's less being said to this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. I think that's a really important question. I mean, because I think that, you know, it's not to say that that teaching and learning function is not a really important one, but I think, and I don't think that this review, you know, we really went into, or we were able to see from the evidence why, to be able to answer that really carefully and clearly. I guess if I think about some of the, from this project and the public good project that I was involved in, it's definitely, there are, I would say, a range of complex factors that come into play. I think some of them are historical. I think the colonial legacy has played a very important role in defining the particular roles of universities and that kind of thing. And, then there's the post things like structural adjustment and those kind of things, all of which, so there's a whole historical set of forces. I think, though, that certainly from this review, if you think about, the sort of limited, there's no doubt that funding is a critical issue, and that, most of the funding goes towards teaching and learning, and that where research funding does exist, it's often driven by particular partnership frameworks, etc., that are not, some of them are really, really important and good, but some of them aren't necessarily the most appropriate, or there are huge issues around the appropriateness for that context, etc. But it's so much is around funding. I don't know if you probably do know this, but now with the COVID thing, the big funding from the UK that is around what they call global engagement stuff, which is a significant amount of that funding that goes to the kind of global North and South partnerships and building research capacity, that's been significantly reduced with major implications for projects and that kind of thing. So, I think as well that there's no doubt that things like resource, like private sector and those kind of things, I don't think those are putting enough resources into contributing. I think higher education maybe remains underfunded, but I just think there's a whole range of complex factors that make that research capacity weak or kind of less strong than some of the others. But I think for me, the really important part is the implications it has for knowledge, and whose knowledge, and what is being drawn on to frame different things, including the SDGs and those kind of things. And so I kind of think that it's one of the most important sort of priorities is to strengthen research capacity across lower middle income countries in the tertiary education systems.
Thank you, Bertha and Colleen. I would like to go with a quick question, basically linking the questions from Melanie and from Bertha from this one about especially the role of funding. And I guess because, I was thinking the same that we were talking about, which kind of journals, all these papers were published, and this might be relevant if they were local researchers or there were researchers from the global north. I was also wondering in terms of book chapters and editorials and publishers that are involved for those that are not necessarily journal articles. But also, I was thinking for this kind of literature review, is it not fundamental to investigate where these researchers get the funds to develop this research, and equally because this is going to impact the research agendas and will give us a perspective of which underlying institutions, international institutions, are driving some research in this area, not the other. So yeah, I guess I was thinking when I saw the table with the name, the publisher, I was thinking like, so we have one with the fund or where the funds from the research is coming from. So we have a more realistic, approach of why the interest and how the interest is aligned with these institutions. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's it's the same as Melanie's thing about the journal, you know, which journals and where the researchers are coming from and everything. And I think that's a really, really good point. I really do. I think absolutely what you're saying is critical. I think though that, you know, I mean, and I don't want to make an excuse, because I think it's a really critical issue that you're raising. But you know, this was a particular project with particular parameters that were, and part of our sort of or kind of terms of reference was around you know, the capacity to strengthen the funding base for tertiary education in low and low middle income countries, and to help the British Council to build a case for why it was so, you know, it's important to be putting money and resources into that. So I think that you know, that was an important part of why we wanted to try and, you know, do this. But it's not to say that those are really, really critical, because I think if you were to do that, and I'm really seriously thinking, I'm quite like to do what you suggested is it would, I think you would find that, I mean, there are instances of government funding or local funding, so, but I would say that I would suggest that 90% of what we looked at would have come from some kind of donor funded or some kind of donor funding or external funding initiative, some connection to external funding, I would say. And yeah, I think that would be really important.
Thank you so much, Colleen. I think we have a last question from Fenella. This will be the last one from this session. Fenella?
Thanks, Carmen. Colleen, thank you for your presentation. Just a quick question is something that pops into my mind, is whether the extent to which, and this maybe links also with Melanie's question about how development is understood, but I'm wondering whether infrastructure and the role of infrastructure came into play. I mean, obviously the whole focus was on tertiary education and the expectations that are being made on education to play a role in development, but the overlap with infrastructure, and I think if I think in low and low middle income countries, the impact of lack of infrastructure on technological development or the labour market or access even to institutions. And so, yeah, I think just a quick question on that, and whether the extent to which that came through in the findings or even in the implications of what tertiary education can do.
Thanks. I think that's a really, really important issue as well. And, you know, I mean, yes, without a doubt. And it certainly would have been one of those, what we called the conditions of possibility, or the enabling or hindering things. So I would say that, infrastructure issues are a major hindering condition or a hindering factor to the capacity of tertiary education to contribute to development. And so there's a number of ways in which, and you could, I think infrastructure would be a range of different ways of thinking about the infrastructure. So it would be institutional infrastructure, whether that is even issues of, physical buildings and those kind of things, but also leadership infrastructure, research infrastructure, infrastructure to as you say, link university campuses or tertiary, TVET colleges to communities like transport. It's a kind of big thing if you think, and I definitely think that that's a critical. You know what? One of the points, and I probably didn't make it strongly enough here, that we tried to emphasize is that, you know, there's this tendency to kind of look at tertiary education as sort of this sort of entity, and it's expected to achieve all these different things, but you can't really understand or think about its role outside of its relationships to other parts of the society. And so I think that infrastructure issue is very important there, is whether the infrastructure exists for those relationships to exist and for it to. So we kind of suggested that it's where that infrastructure, or where those relationships, or where those kind of interconnections are not being enabled, or not being, or don't exist, or being undermined, or whatever, that is significantly important to understanding tertiary education's role in being able to contribute to development. And you can't really understand the role outside of that, that understanding. So yeah, I would really agree. I think it's really, really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Fenella. Unfortunately, we don't have more time today, but we hope that all this conversation continues in a kind of more informal settings. I would like to once again thank you, Colleen, for being here with us in this first session. It's been wonderful to hear from all the data and all this interesting questioning within the research and the question that you brought for discussion. Thank you for everyone in the audience for attending the session and for asking questions and engaging in a really rich debate today. And yeah, unfortunately, this is the end of the session today. We will keep you posted about our next webinar, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you, Colleen, for being here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for asking me. It's really been a nice opportunity to hear your thoughts and for all the questions and everything. Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. It was great. It's really good. Thank you so much.
That was super interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. I'm trying to start sharing my screen so I can say goodbye to everybody properly, but I don't know how to do that. Oh, yeah, no. Yeah. Okay. Bye. It was very nice to see you all. It was lovely to see these friendly faces on the other side. Yeah. So.